Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today, along with a new face. I'm Amber Duke, joined at the desk by Dan Cannonen.
Hey, Amber.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thanks
Great to be
for being here.
I'm super excited to be here.
Great. Well, let's jump right into the news. Mike Waltz is officially out as National Security Advisor and could be stepping into a new role, United States Ambassador to the United Nations. President Trump wrote on Truth Social, from his time in uniform on the battlefield, in Congress, and as my National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz has worked hard to put our nation's interests first. I know he will do the same in his new role. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio will serve as the interim National Security Advisor. Users on social media are sounding off about the decision and calling out Waltz for Signalgate. The Federalist editor-in-chief Molly Hemingway writes, "I like Mike Waltz, but we should probably not forget the tragic mistake of adding Jeffrey Goldberg, of all people in the universe, to a Signal chat. Lots of journalists just kind of skidding right over that."
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says, now do Hegseth. So, should more people be punished for Signalgate like Schumer suggests?
All right, so I think this was probably a long time coming. In fact, if anything, from what I'm hearing from Republican sources, is that Mike Waltz's problems with Signalgate, I guess we could say,
Yeah.
his issue with adding Jeffrey Goldberg to that chat actually prolonged his tenure because Trump did not want to give a scalp to the Atlantic.
Right.
And so he was clashing with administration officials prior to that. He's obviously more hawkish compared to some of the non-interventionist members of the administration.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gets the gift of the Atlantic attacking him, so he gets to sort of skate by for a little bit, which is really a shame because he should have been held accountable for Signalgate, I think, from the get-go. But I think conservatives who are big fans of Trump's America First agenda will probably have no love lost for Mike Waltz leaving his role as National Security Advisor.
I think that's probably right. And I think that Mike Waltz also, from his politics before his time in the administration, wasn't always a MAGA, never or a Trump guy, right? He came into this world a little bit later than others did. But I think the real question for Democrats and for those watching this with Signalgate is not so much how it affects Waltz and his prospects of becoming ambassador to the UN. I think it's much more about what this means for the investigation into Signalgate. Mick Mulvaney last night in The Hill made this point really well, that this opens up the door for Democrats and others to probe deeper into what happened, not just with adding Jeffrey Goldberg. That was a huge mistake, and I think obviously enraged Trump. But the question for me is, what does that mean for the others on that chain, for sharing that information? Pete Hegseth has shared it with other chains, including his family and folks outside of the government, a private lawyer. That kind of reckless abuse of national security information is going to get really a microscopic analysis by House Democrats. I think that could come back to bite, maybe not Waltz, but maybe Hegseth.
Right, and Hegseth, of course, has been in the news for quite some time because of these secondary abuses that you've talked about, for good reason, I think. And I know that Trump and Vance have said that they're standing by Pete Hegseth, but I know that Republicans are starting to get pretty wary of his ability to do the job properly, and I think it's obviously reasonable to say that if you share private details, potentially classified details about upcoming strikes on U.S. adversaries, that's a huge problem, and that should be bipartisan, in my opinion. The thing that's interesting about pushing Mike Waltz over to the UN ambassador role, first of all, Elise Stefanik must be livid.
Oof. And how?
Right? But I think it's kind of a way to say, well, I didn't fire him, he's just being reassigned, and kind of trying to tamp down some of the what will be scuttlebutt about, the administration's in chaos, Trump is losing people, and he gets to kind of rein Mike Waltz in, because let's be real, when you're UN ambassador, your job is to read a script, right? You get your marching orders from the administration, you go to the UN meetings, and you say what's on the paper in front of you. He can't really go rogue, he can't bring in staffers that maybe are counter to the America First idea of foreign policy. He has to stay on message.
I think that's right. And your point about Stefanik, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think the whole politics of this is on this precarious posture for Trump and for the administration. Remember, Stefanik is not there in the first place because the House is so narrow and they can't pass these bills without her vote that they couldn't get her out of that caucus. And so Waltz goes there to fill that gap and fix that problem. Okay, fine. And you're right, that was a convenient way to get him out of this national security advisor role, which Trump was obviously eager to do at this point. But all this means, I think, whether it's the Republicans' uncomfortable posture with Pete Hegseth, not just because of how he's sharing information, but how he's managing the department. I hear all the time that they're really happy about the troop and military recruitment numbers. Like that's the thing he's doing that they think is fantastic. And Trump likes him on TV. Trump likes him as this attack dog. But those that want the Pentagon managed well have to be just enraged and flummoxed by Hegseth. And we all knew this going in. This is a guy with no military experience, no management experience in the military, that is, right? He's been a Fox News host. He's certainly had some service, which is laudable. But to never have run a big organization, and the small organizations that he did run had these massive problems financially and otherwise. And so to me, there's this lapse of judgment with Signalgate, but there's this bigger question of just experience. And so you've got this guy running the Pentagon that Republicans don't really trust to run the Pentagon, and now you've got Mike Waltz going to the UN. All of it, I think, is just on this bed of precarious politics that could bite the administration at some point.
Yeah, and you've also seen several high-profile staffers from the DoD exit recently and being accused of leaking, the whole thing is very strange. These people are insistent that they did not leak anything. They're people who are pretty well trusted in the conservative movement.
Yeah.
Hegseth, however, has gone on TV and gone very fiery about the idea that they were totally sharing classified info, but all of the people who left were notably people who were counter to some of the hawkish tendencies of the neoconservatives. And so to me, it seems like more of an ideological battle that's taking place in both DoD and the State Department, rather than this battle over competency or leaking information and things like that.
I think it's that. I mean, look at John Bolton. Definitely someone who's a neocon and a hawk on this stuff. Not a fan necessarily where Donald Trump goes on national security or some of his more controversial decisions at this point. But I think it's partly the policy disagreement that you point out, but I think also it's about, are you going to come in and have just total fidelity to Donald Trump, never admit a mistake, like just stick to the plan? And what Trump likes about Hegseth is that he will do whatever Donald Trump wants him to do. If that means getting rid of high-ranking officials, if that means cleaning house, if that means being on attack on TV, he will do that. Trump likes that. He hated the idea in his first term that his chief of staff or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or other military advisors would tell him not to do things. He wants folks that will just be empowered by his word at full stop at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a little more complicated than that, because there were individuals who were sort of undermining and trying to subvert Trump's agenda rather than just telling him things that he didn't want to hear. For example, the Afghanistan withdrawal, there were multiple defense secretaries who were trying to slow walk that from Donald Trump. And so I think it's reasonable for the executive to want to exercise some semblance of political control over his appointees, rather than just it being like a blind loyalty type of question. But at the same time, what you say about Hegseth in terms of his competency, I think what people liked about the nomination and the appointment was that he did bring fresh ideas to the DoD, to the Pentagon, but you have to be able to execute those well. And that's something that I think a lot of Republicans and conservatives are kind of concerned about at this point, is he doing the execution properly? Yeah,
there are 2 million employees and a $1 trillion budget. Like if you never manage something, more than a couple dozen people, and that's the experience of Pete Hegseth, pretty hard to imagine leveling up that quickly to something this big, this complicated, and execute your ideas. And he said something in an interview, one of the tarmac interviews, when the Signalgate was really raging, that I just caught and thought it was so telling about what he sees as his role in this administration. He talked about how all he was doing was reporting out, to the others on that chain what was happening at CENTCOM. And I thought to myself, boy, if you are the Secretary of Defense and you think your job is just to report out like you're the White House liaison to DOD, that's really such an underselling of the value and the gravitas of that role. And I think, again, Trump sees him as someone who will be a face of the department, focus on recruitment, do what he wants him to do, but never has this person had the experience to run the department as complicated as this.
And just one quick analogy before we wrap. If you look at what's going on the immigration side of things, he does have the face in Kristi Noem running Department of Homeland Security, but he has an experienced individual in Tom Homan actually executing the vision for the policy as the borders are. And on the Pentagon side of things, you have Hegseth as the face, but it doesn't seem like there's a similar Tom Homan-esque person who is helping him actually run the department and execute the vision.
And they let go some of the folks that maybe had that position or posture.
Exactly. All right. Up next, bad news for NPR and PBS. We'll tell you what it is here on Rising. President Trump has some bad news for NPR and PBS. Trump ordered the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to end its funding of the two outlets. Trump wrote in his order, "At the very least, Americans have the right to expect that if their tax dollars fund public broadcasting at all, they fund only fair, accurate, unbiased, and nonpartisan news coverage."
NPR responded to the news, writing in a statement, "Eliminating funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting would have a devastating impact on American communities across the nation that rely on public radio for trusted local and national news, culture, life-saving emergency alerts, and public safety information."
Executive Director for Foundation for Freedom Online, Mike Benz, wrote on X, "It's obvious to the point of tautology that if more than half of the country hates your news slant, more than half of the country should not be forced to pay for it."
On the other hand, editor of the Left Hook Substack, Wajahat Ali, wrote on Blue Sky, "Trump is about to do for NPR and PBS what he did for the Canadian Liberals."
Oh, and look, I think that would be fine, right? If NPR and PBS want to be liberal outlets, then they're allowed to do that, but the taxpayer should not have to fund it. And I know that women in DC everywhere are clutching their NPR tote bags with a death grip right now, but to me, this is long overdue.
Well, look, NPR has 1% of its budget come from federal funding. It is
Right.
almost entirely from member donations and from sponsorships. But here's the problem. There's 246 local stations in the NPR network that are not political shows that people object to, or they're not even the news that folks think have some kind of slant, which I don't think they do, obviously. But they are local news. It's weather, it's public safety information. That's largely where the federal dollars go. That's stuff that people will miss, especially in rural communities where it's really hard to build an infrastructure. And if you just rely on what you can do on the corporate side, they're going to go to the big markets, and what's left behind are people in the middle of the country that need that for agricultural purposes, for public safety purposes, and just to cover the local stories happening in their community.
I'm actually amenable to the idea of keeping funding for the local stations and just cutting it off from the federal public broadcasting outlets.
That's what it is, though, for the most part.
What do you mean?
The 1% of the budget that goes there really does go to fund those local stations, and the very little bit of that comes to maybe the national shows.
Right, but then cut out the middleman, right? Give it directly to the local stations so that NPR doesn't get the money. And if it's only 1% that NPR is getting anyway, then they don't really need it for their operations. So let's give the money directly to the local outlets that are not doing the political slant. And you know what? I'm a donor to KET, so
Excellent.
I get it. I'm a huge fan.
Do you have the tote?
No, I do not have a tote. We do have a sticker on our fridge. But I think, it really is about NPR and PBS. And for the past 10, 20 years, these outlets, to me, have become unrecognizable. And the White House sent out a fact sheet this morning with some examples of the bias, and it's like 6 pages long. And I'm just reading through this, and they're linking to, obviously,
Sure.
publicly reported stories, apologizing for calling illegal immigrants illegal, featured a Valentine's Day story around queer animals, devoted a panel to white privilege. I mean, this is not something that most Americans want their taxpayer dollars helping to support.
Well, again, I don't think those kind of stories in the national network is being funded by taxpayer dollars largely. And secondly, look, there's a lot of content in the world. If you're talking about, a news network that has 246 stations, a national network, and also this need to broadcast consistently, are you going to find and be able to cherry pick some examples of a story or two or a slant or two that gets people irate and upset? Sure you will. But when I listen to NPR, one of the things they do that I really love and I think is so important is that if they have a story where any facet of that story touches some part of their funding, whether it's a federal government funding, whether it's a grant from a foundation, they will name that and list that at the top of the story as they go into it.
Well, that's basic journalistic ethics.
It doesn't happen very often when I see it on Fox News or on other networks, right? So they do this, I think, consistently in a way that does create a measure of trust and a lack of bias. And they report stories, I think, in this cadence and this fact-driven way that lets people access deeper what's really going on. Now, sure, there can be some anchors, some programs that come in with a perspective. There's some where it's less about straight news and more about opinion. But again, those are largely funded by member contributions and not by the federal government. The federal government's funding really the network, which is about a public service.
It's really not cherry picking, though, when the editor-in-chief, Catherine Marr, goes to testify in front of Congress and they're reading tweets to her. Congressman Brandon Gill has this list of tweets about white privilege and hating Trump and threats to democracy. And her excuse is, well, I don't remember saying that.
Yeah.
Or I didn't mean it when I said it. I mean, I think you would agree that it's a serious problem if the editor-in-chief of a news outlet is openly sharing these incredibly progressive opinions on social media and expecting that that's not going to color her coverage or the coverage of her employees.
Yep.
And the fact that she doesn't even admit to believing these things. So what, you just say things on social media that you don't believe? I mean, at the very least, Catherine Marr needs to get the heck out.
I will agree with you on this point. I think if you're going to have the public trust as part of your mandate, whether you're funded by the federal government or whether you're in the federal government or you're in some other public institution, you have a higher standard to keep yourself above the fray. You can believe things, and everyone comes into their job, everybody, with some measure of bias and some level of opinion, and that's not cause for me to cut federal funding. Now, at the same time, can I say that someone in that position should be more careful with what they put out online, because that can certainly be used to imply some bias? Absolutely, they have to stay above the fray, and she didn't. That's a fair point. But at the end of the day, I don't think you cut the funding to local outlets reporting on weather and public emergencies because of that misjudgment. That's just not the right way to approach this.
I think the other important piece of context here is that in regards to the 1% number when it comes to NPR, those local outlets also pay for the licensing fees, which end up actually making up about 14 to 15% of the total NPR budget. So again, I think cutting out the middleman, giving these local outlets access to the licensing on their own through federal dollars, allowing them to continue to operate without having to give a kickback to NPR would solve a lot of this problem for most people.
Well, look, all this is expensive. Infrastructure in local communities across the country and rural communities is really hard to build. And I'm pretty sympathetic to the overall cost of building and maintaining a media apparatus that can do good reporting, do good sourcing, have the infrastructure to broadcast it and reach people. That stuff is not done very easily. I'm loath to micromanage how they've done the license fees and use the grant funding and the federal funding to make all that work. But look, if we want to have a really good conversation about how to make sure that people in America can get news they can rely on, that is unbiased, that's trusted, that gets them the information that lets them live their lives more safely and more comfortably, we should have that conversation. But that involves, to me, further infrastructure build out on broadband, further infrastructure build out on how to access these stations and expansion of that. It doesn't involve cutting and cherry picking some stories to make a political point.
I disagree with the cherry picking. I think it's pretty pervasive, but that's fair. I mean, you obviously come at this from a different political perspective than I do. But the other element of this that we should probably mention is that this would probably have to be done through a rescission process, because the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has funding doled out by Congress for 2 years. So the executive order is obviously going to be challenged in court, but also on the grounds that Congress has to have exercise some control over this.
And they should. There's a role for Congress to have the purse strings and to control the budget, with the executive proposing and the Congress then actually executing on that faction. And on PBS, which we didn't talk about that much, look, people really enjoy the broadcasting that they put out there, especially for kids. And Sesame Street and other programs like that are kind of a vital part of how kids in this country grow up. I think people in this country are not going to be excited about cuts to that kind of programming.
I think the good news is that if people are really excited about these networks and the shows that they have, if Trump does cut this funding, I see no problem with them being able to raise the funds through donations to make up that deficit.
That could be.
All right, up next on Rising, lawmakers traveling to El Salvador. Is it a protest or a political stunt?
A Trump-appointed judge in Texas ruled Thursday that President Trump unlawfully invoked the Alien Enemies Act when he deported more than 200 migrants to a mega prison in El Salvador. The judge also blocked the administration from making any further deportations under the 18th century law.
That ruling only applies to the Southern District of Texas and is expected to be appealed. Meanwhile, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries says he's directing his caucus to halt trips to El Salvador after Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen's trip kicked off a series of trips by other Democrats. Senator Ted Cruz took a shot at Jeffries and the House Dems on X, saying, "Hakeem, allowing your members to fly to El Salvador on the taxpayers' dime to play footsie with violent gang members was obviously astonishingly bad politics. Please keep it up." But Jeffries fired back, citing Cruz's poorly timed trip to Cancun during that deadly winter storm that hit Texas in 2021, saying, quote, "Nobody takes you seriously at this point, and that's Leader Jeffries to you, Edward." So far, 5 U.S. lawmakers made the trip to El Salvador, including Senator Van Hollen, all to protest the mistaken deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. All right, so there's a couple of things going on here. Obviously, the Alien Enemies Act being under fire, and then also the sort of political squabbles over the trips to El Salvador. I suppose let's start with the Alien Enemies Act. I think what was interesting about the judge's order is that it basically left room for the administration to provide further evidence of the incursion that they've cited in invoking that act to expedite deportations. And what the administration is probably going to argue is that they have recently declassified an FBI document that indicated members of the Venezuelan government were directing Tren de Aragua members to go to the U.S. to carry out political assassinations. So that will probably be the crux of the additional information that they give to the judge, and then we will see whether he continues with blockage of use of the act or whether or not the Trump administration prevails on that point. But this will be appealed, and we'll see what happens.
Well, and it's interesting because this only applied to that circuit. It wasn't a national ruling at this point, and I do think that the case will continue in the ways you described. To me, there's a really big question about not just the narrow legal constraints of the Alien Enemies Act, but the broader question of separation of powers and due process in this country. And I'll go back to Antonin Scalia, very conservative former Supreme Court justice, who Democrats loathed while he was on the court. We didn't agree with him on any of the policy positions and substance of his rulings for many cases, but someone who was just completely consistent on the idea that separation of powers and due process, which should apply to all residents, all people located in this country, not just citizens, was an important tenet of the Constitution. It's very clearly there. And then secondly, that the separation of powers itself is the thing that makes us distinct and different from other democracies. We can have a Bill of Rights, we can have elected officials and policy statements, but if you don't have that separation of powers that provides those checks and balances between Congress, the judiciary, and the executive branch, then eventually it all kind of falls apart. And what I think this judge is doing, besides opening the door, as you say, to let the administration make its case, and they should be able to make the case and prove to a court and to the American public, frankly, why this does belong under the Alien Enemies Act. At the same time, that standard should be high, and Congress and the court should have a role to play in articulating whether that's proper or not.
And just to clarify a point we did in the opening read, Hakeem Jeffries, on directing his caucus to halt trips to El Salvador, that is based on a report. We do not have an exact quote from him to confirm that, so just wanted to clarify that. But on the separation of powers, just to clarify what you were saying about that, are you saying like the court has a role to play in making sure that the Trump administration is carrying out the Alien Enemies Act as instructed, or that the actual immigration powers should be subject to separation of powers?
Well, look, I think the court has to interpret the law and then enforce that, right? And the executive branch has to be the action to actually implement the law on the ground. Congress, of course, makes the laws. And what's happened so far is that this administration has wanted to be judge, jury, and executioner on every law that they want to execute and act on, and interpret the way they want to interpret, ignore where they want to ignore. And Trump has said, when Janet Mills stood up in that East Room event, and he went back at her, he said, "We are the law, right? The federal government is the law." That's not how this works. I think the court is providing space for the administration to make their case, but they're asserting their role in this process. And frankly, I think by extension, asserting the role that Congress has in this process as well if the law does not extend far enough.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, though, the Alien Enemies Act is a law passed by Congress that does confer this power to the executive branch. It does not leave room for Congress to be involved in these decisions, right?
Not in this decision, but I think the whole point of this is that the administration is moving fast and recklessly in a way that runs right over due process. And what Scalia would have said about all of this debate, whether it's on this narrow question on AEA, or whether it's on the question of Abrego Garcia, or the question of any of the issues with deportations happening in college campuses, if you're going to take someone's liberty, whether they are a citizen or not, that has to be a very high bar. Taking of liberty is the thing a government should not do unless they can prove it is warranted under our laws. And so far, this administration has not done a very good job of proving any of the assertions they've made publicly. This court's giving them that chance to both prove the assertions and make the case, but they have to do that.
So I think on the issue of due process, I mean, the first thing I would say is that I would agree with the Supreme Court's indication that they should provide some level of time before deporting people under the Alien Enemies Act for their lawyers to be able to challenge the assertions that they are gang members in court. I think that's reasonable. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to challenge you a bit on your claim that the administration has not done a good job of proving its claims. Are you referring specifically to the Abrego Garcia case?
I think across the board, they have been inconsistent both with what the president has said, with what Vance has said, with what Pam Bondi has said, and then what's argued in the courts. And whether it's on, I'm kind of broadly speaking in this case, right? Whether it's on Abrego Garcia, or whether it's on the Alien Enemies Act, or whether it's on some of the court actions on DOGE and taking away funding from the IRA or the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program at EPA, where they've alleged fraud and abuse and then had nothing in court to back them up. It's often the case they make these broad, sweeping arguments and statements publicly in a political context, and then in court they got basically nothing to back up the assertions at a political level. It's a problem both for them in court. It's also a problem for inconsistency and trust with the public.
Do you think that the Democrats made a political error by going to El Salvador?
Oh boy, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I think that Van Hollen doing it was good because it asserted, hey guys, we should not be afraid of this fight. It's not just about immigration and deportation, it's about due process and liberty for everybody, and I can make it about that case if I can go and take some action. That was good. I think now the kind of copycat cattle call of folks going, it's a really poor facsimile of what Van Hollen was able to accomplish, and that can't be the only note that we have as Democrats. Let's move on to the issues that Americans want to talk about.
I think the problem for Van Hollen was that there was a lot of misleading reporting about who Kilmer Abrego Garcia was.
Sure.
So in the media, there were these claims that he was just a Maryland father, which implied that he had legal status in the U.S., which he did not, and obviously swept under the rug a lot of his alleged gang affiliations, the domestic violence protection orders filed by his wife, and then the alleged human trafficking stop down in Tennessee. And so he ran off to advocate on behalf of his quote-unquote constituent, leaving behind actual constituents, Marylanders, while all of this reporting was coming out about Abrego Garcia's very storied past. And it really handed Republicans, in my opinion, a really great way to get around the concerns about the mistaken deportation, the administrative error, because now he is seen publicly advocating for an alleged gangbanger.
Well, look, I think that with Abrego Garcia and Van Hollen, at the end of the day, he can be an alleged good father and an alleged gang member, and the point is they're allegations. We don't know. And sweeping him off with no time whatsoever to an El Salvador gulag without any kind of process is exactly why we need to have that process in place to adjudicate these claims before the actions are taken. And I don't take for granted that he's a great guy, but I also don't take for granted that he's a gang member. And we need to have a way to differentiate between those two and have a process that's not just run by fiat.
What I think should happen is that the Trump administration should just object to the withholding of removal, because having read through the court documents, the evidence that he was a member of MS-13, I find very compelling. Obviously, 2 immigration judges did initially as well. I don't think it would be difficult for the Trump administration to go to immigration court and say, look, there's 2 reasons why we want to lift this withholding of removal. 1, there's great evidence that he is been involved in very significant criminal activity. And 2, the conditions in El Salvador have changed. The gang that he claimed he was in fear of his life from is effectively decimated under Bukele.
Yep.
And I think that they would probably prevail. And then we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Maybe they would, but there's reporting, which I can't claim to say is true because I've not seen all the evidence. A court yet has not seen all the evidence. But there's reporting that he testified against these gangs when in Venezuela, when they tried to shake down his mother's store.
Her pusteria, right?
Yes, and that's the basis for the removal order in the first place, the non-removal order in the first place. I don't know if that's true.
He didn't say that in his request for asylum.
He did not, but that came out. It was part of the discussion in the 2019 process. So my point is, we don't know if that's true. We don't know what the gang affiliations are. Let's run this to a real court proceeding with evidence before a judge.
Up next on Rising, Governor Gretchen Whitmer is underwater apparently over a hug. It's the hug scene around the world, and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's embrace of President Trump is landing her in hot water. The moment came after Trump landed in the governor's home state on Tuesday to celebrate a new fighter jet mission at a National Guard base, and their interaction is sparking some backlash. Whitmer has come under scrutiny within her own party recently for building a closer working relationship with Trump. The governor visited the White House earlier in April and was heavily criticized for the move. Whitmer is standing up against her critics, saying she's trying to find common ground with the president for the people of Michigan. She's also seen as a likely 2028 presidential contender. Users on X sounded off about the embrace. Podcast host Keith Olbermann writing, "Poor Gretchen Whitmer's future is now reduced to co-hosting a podcast with Gavin Newsom." Others rushed to Whitmer's defense. Democratic strategist Mike Nellis says, "You won't catch me complaining about Gretchen Whitmer saving tens of thousands of jobs or bringing in federal relief for people without power in Michigan. That's the damn job." All right, Dan, so let's start with your take on this.
Yeah.
As the resident Democrat on the panel, was Gretchen Whitmer's embrace of Trump good politics or perhaps the end of her career?
Boy, the word embrace has a couple of meanings here, doesn't it?
Right.
I think that Gretchen Whitmer, I'll go back to the Mike Nellis point first. She is trying to deliver a military base in Michigan that means so much to that state. It's good for the military, it's the jobs, as he pointed out. It's a huge win, and she's been working on this for a long time, right? And so if you're working on this thing that you know matters to your constituents, your job as governor is to deliver. I think it'd be malpractice for her to sit this out and not work with the administration, especially when there's so much chaos and turmoil in federal spending, that if you didn't engage, something could happen here that really upsets the apple cart on this important accomplishment, which she wants to deliver. So I'm with Mike Nellis on this point. I don't think there's any problem with her working with the admin, working with Trump. Now, then you get to the optics, right? Like the embrace itself, the hug, or perhaps her in the Oval Office with the binder above her face. I think that was a much bigger problem for her than actually working on these things. It's a needle to thread. Democrats want someone to fight, but also voters want people to fight for them, and she is fighting for her constituents if she's making sure that they deliver on this important accomplishment for Michigan.
Yeah, so I actually completely agree that this was a very smart political move and good governance by Gretchen Whitmer. Macomb County, obviously, really important swing state.
Huge.
District. Trump won it in 2016 and 2024. Gretchen Whitmer won it twice.
Yep.
And bringing those jobs back, bringing this cherished air base, this really critical mission of building these warthogs is incredibly important to that swing district.
Yep.
And should not be overlooked. And if the governor did that, I think that would have been political malpractice. And I think she's doing what the majority of voters want to see, which is they want Republicans and Democrats to work together when applicable, when it makes sense.
Yep.
And they want to see Democrats work with the Trump administration on areas of agreement. And she has done that better than anybody else in the Democratic Party right now. And it's interesting to see the criticism of Chuck Schumer, for example, for apparently not fighting hard enough to stop the Trump agenda versus Whitmer's approach, which is I'm actually going to find common ground with him, and whether it's on tariffs or this jobs program, bringing the warthogs back to Macomb County, I'm going to make sure I get that done for my residents, for my constituents. And even on the tariff question, I thought the way that she framed it was a really smart approach for a Democrat, which is I don't necessarily agree with the implementation or the strategy behind it, but I agree with the concept of tariffs in principle.
Sure, and I think the thing that we get wrapped up in Washington is how you're perceived in the moment, maybe on social media, maybe in the immediate reaction to something like this, like the embrace. But what the left should really avoid doing, and I'm worried sometimes we go in this direction, is to take the factional power available to you as opposed to taking real power. And what I mean by that is, if you just want to be the number one fighter of Trump, and that we are always on the outside, that also diminishes us. That makes us not really at level with him, going toe-to-toe with him. We're just screaming and complaining, and that is not enough. People want to see that you can actually deliver on something. And so I thought that Whitmer doing that was good. One of the best, I mentioned this last night in the Hill, but one of the best moments I've seen from just an optics standpoint was when Trump got off the plane in California when the wildfire response was happening, and Gavin Newsom met him on the tarmac. Now, whatever you think about Gavin Newsom and California's response to the wildfires, or Trump's for that matter, the optics of those two guys, together on that tarmac, you remember Newsom kind of pointed at him, kind of slapped him on the side a little bit. It was a bit of a tense conversation, and then they went to the sticks and they had the same conversation directly together to the folks there. I felt like that was Gavin Newsom saying, I am at your level, we're going to work together on this, and people could see, they couldn't hear the audio, but they could see him engaging with him in a way that put him on the stage. Whitmer was on the stage with Trump. She was delivering something with Trump. That elevates her, and if we're just going to be the protest party, that is not going to cut it in 2028.
Yeah, and you know what? Just from a strategy standpoint in terms of getting Democratic agenda items done, it's no secret that Trump likes when people flatter him, and he likes to make deals, and it doesn't matter if it's across the aisle. If he thinks something is good policy, he will work with Democrats to do it. He's not really that partisan of a guy, contrary to some popular belief. And I think Democrats would get a lot further with this administration if they actually played a little nicer instead of reflexively opposing everything the administration does.
Yes, and I'll say this. The stuff that we talk about, the stuff that Twitter talks about, the stuff that's on other cable news networks is often the stuff that sort of cuts through because it's interesting. but it's not necessarily the thing that the vast majority of Americans need. And if Democrats expect their elected officials to only jump on the hot button stuff and then therefore fight exclusively on that, as opposed to keeping their eye on the ball of jobs, tens of thousands for their constituents, that's what got us in trouble in 2024. The voters thought that we took our eye off the ball on inflation and put it on other issues. That burned us. Gretchen Whitmer is saying, my eye is on the ball of Michiganders, of jobs, and delivering. If that means I have to go talk to Donald Trump to get that done, fine.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how she performs if she does run for president in 2028.
Yeah.
Because she obviously has been cozier with the Trump administration than most Democrats. But she received a lot of flack for her pandemic response. But I wonder if that's going to be so far removed at that point from the political conversation, having been 8 years on since the onset of the pandemic, that she might be able to gloss over that a little bit.
I think so. And just think back at how much has happened in 103 days. That pandemic response is going to feel pretty distant in the rearview mirror by the time we get to 2028. I think the bigger question for her, and for all Democrats, frankly, is how do you navigate this moment when tensions are so high, right? And voters want different things, but they want action from Democrats. But then you have this challenge of actually delivering and being on the same stage and being in the news and being notable and cutting through. All that's really difficult to manage. And then you fast forward to 2028 and what I think voters are going to want of both parties after all of this, I suspect at least, is a real turn the page moment on all of it. You know, they don't love what Democrats are doing. Our numbers are not great. They don't love what Trump's doing. He's underwater in basically every single issue except the border. And I think when you get to that point, the Democrat that can sort of be in the news enough, but then also express, I'm the one that can help turn the page on all this nasty politics, is going to be in the best position. That's the needle to thread, and we'll see.
Say it with me, Dan. Turn the
page.
Well, that was Gwen Waltz, right?
It was.
Up next, Dems going after their own. We'll tell you what's going on Rising. Can it get any worse for Chuck Schumer? A new CNN poll released earlier this week shows that Senate Minority Leader Schumer had a 44% unfavorability rating and only 17% favorable. When confronted by CNN's Manu Raju about this above poll, Schumer said, "Polls come and go. Our party is united." MSNBC host Jen Psaki also had some choice words for Schumer. Here she is on Stephen Colbert's late night show. Let's watch.
Far too many are still relying on the old tactics
Yep.
of Everlore.
But Chuck Schumer, he wrote a very strong letter.
With 8 strongly worded questions.
What more can you ask of a leader?
You left out that part.
That's exactly
if
right.
If that's not going to make you shake in your boots, I don't know what is.
Jen Psaki had this to say about Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and the Democratic Party's recent moves. Let's take a look.
I'm a fighter. I'm going to say the things. I'm going to call out the do-nothing Democrats, his words, not my words. He's going to call out what he's seeing in the Trump administration. And I think what we're seeing right now is there is a divide, basically. There are people who are out there doing stuff. And by doing stuff, I mean it can be anything. Go lead a protest, go to a red state, go hold a town hall, go to El Salvador, whatever it may be. Do stuff. People want to know you're fighting and doing things.
All right, I'm very curious about your perspective on this. I mean, the way that I've been looking at it is, what exactly do they expect Chuck Schumer to do?
Well, that is true. I mean, we do not have any levers of power in Congress, in the Senate, in the House, in the executive branch, obviously. There's not much Chuck can do. And the other problem is that people want someone who can cut through and resonate with voters. And boy, that is not Chuck Schumer. You know, I will say this about him. Chuck Schumer, the Democrats in the Senate, won 4 seats in states that Donald Trump carried: Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada, right? Donald Trump and the Republicans didn't carry any Republicans in states that Kamala Harris won. And on the House side, kind of the same thing. But it's really tough to do that. It's tough to win in Arizona with Ruben Gallego in a state you lost by 5.5 points top of the ticket, but delivered a senator, despite that. So I do think that Chuck Schumer has done a great job of with a very difficult hand politically and a very difficult map for Democrats, keeping the margin as tight as it is in the Senate. On that basis, a very successful leader and has been. And he knows how to run his caucus. But we're asking a lot of him to be the messenger for the entire Democratic apparatus. We had this a little bit in 2016 as well, but that will change. You know, if Hakeem Jeffries becomes speaker in a year and a half, which could happen, a little pressure off Schumer. I think what Ken Martin is doing at the DNC Jen Psaki mentioned town halls. Ken's got this whole people's town hall effort to go to red districts and engage people and explain what's happening and cut through directly on the ground. That stuff is really good. I think that Schumer himself can't solve this problem. He's taking a lot of incoming. He's probably worthy of some of the snark, like the strongly worded letter, but it is a tough spot for him to be in.
Yeah, he's not exactly the most charismatic guy, but
No.
I'm glad you brought up Hakeem Jeffries because I was going to ask about this. Do you think that he should be taking a more forward-facing role as part of the sort of new generation of Democratic leadership, or is his handing off the mantle to Chuck Schumer maybe indicative of his potential weakness as a party leader?
I'd like to see the Leader Jeffries that is, step up more. One thing I've noticed is that Donald Trump consistently refers to Nancy Pelosi in terms that imply that she still runs the Democratic caucus. And we know
Which I think a lot of people believe.
well, and she wields a lot of power still, right? She's very influential, but she's not really running the caucus. She's not running the D-Trip, she's not running HMP, she's not running the day-to-day in that operation. Sure, she's still there, casts a big shadow on the politics. But the fact that Donald Trump can sort of do that and Jeffries sort of skates by not really in the frame for most Americans, I think is a problem. And I do think that if he wants to be the strong leader, and he should be, by the way, if he becomes speaker, that's a massively important role and the only counterbalance we'll have to this administration. We need him to be strong and have that strength. And I would like to see him step up more.
I think it's fair to say, too, from an outsider's perspective, that when Nancy Pelosi was in charge, she did a much better job of keeping the caucus cohesive.
Yeah.
She really tamped down a lot of the antics of the squad, for example, when they first got into Congress and got them voting consistently with her legislative priorities, even though they were more progressive on a lot of those issues. And now it seems like there's a lot more fracturing happening as the Democratic Party is trying to decide where it goes after this past election.
I think that's less Jeffries and Pelosi's dynamic than it is just the nature of this moment.
Okay.
I mean, Democrats do not know how to respond to this onslaught in 100 days, the rhetoric, the lawlessness, the speed at which things are happening out of Trump. It's really tough, and we don't have a natural place to gravitate behind, whether it's Schumer, Jeffries, or anybody else, or Ken Martin. It's just very difficult to find our footing. So I give him a little bit of slack on that. And I will say that in the last Congress, all those big bills that were passed, whether it was debt limit or CRs or anything to get the government moving, they were often passed, if not exclusively passed, with more Democratic votes than Republican votes, because Mike Johnson could not get the votes. And that was partly because Jeffries did a great job of holding that caucus together and not caving under pressure from the Republicans. He did the thing that Pelosi suggested, or you suggested she did well, which is keep the caucus together on the votes. I think he will do that part well. But I think on the messaging and the leadership, that's where we need to see him step up.
And on the point about Ken Martin and the DNC, obviously there's been a lot of consternation about David Hogg trying to challenge in primaries these Democrats in safe seats. He's been sort of wrapped on the knuckles for that by the DNC and gotten into these very public spats with strategist James Carville. I mean, how much do you think that really impacts the party's ability to kind of move forward and decide what the messaging and the policies are going to be?
Or the Carville-Hogg spat was not something I had in my bingo card for 2025, but here we are.
Me neither.
No, look, I think there's a couple things happening here. One is that people don't really understand what the DNC does. People think the DNC is this all-powerful, democratic, controlling institution. They thought this in 2016. One of my big complaints about Bernie Sanders and that campaign was pretending the DNC really had any real authority to put someone in charge. It just isn't true. The DNC is the backbone of the party from an infrastructure standpoint. They fund state parties, they have the data operation, they build out the organization that is then used by candidates, but they should not be putting their thumb on the scale in primaries. They simply cannot do that, and David Hogg has to understand that. I think David Hogg, at the same time, is making a good point, which is that we've got too many people in power or running for seats or in seats that do not connect with voters, do not resonate, and because of that, we're having a hard time cutting through. So yes, we need a new generation. Yes, we need candidates that can cut through. All of those things are true, but you can't be, as Ken Martin says, the player and the referee. If you're in the DNC, you've got to be impartial.
I'm also curious if David Hogg's insistence on getting young leadership in the Democratic Party really means more progressive leadership, which I actually think is the opposite thing that the party needs right now, as voters have really recoiled from that political ideology.
Yeah, I think people sometimes think that you can only cut through if you're on the extremes ideologically. But, Steve Bannon said this, and I have to agree, and maybe the only thing I agree with Steve Bannon on, that the politics is downstream from culture. You can
That was
tap
Andrew Breitbart.
Breitbart, not
Yeah.
banned. Yes, you can tap into culture, whether you're left, right, or in the center. That's not an ideological question. So I think what we really need are people that can tap into the culture and communicate with folks authentically, whether you are in the moderate or whether you're in the left wing of the party. That's what we need.
Up next on Rising, can a social media detox improve your well-being? We're asking the experts. Is social media bad for you? Well, there's been a lot of speculation. For years now, the toll social platforms like Instagram and Facebook take on mental health have been examined. But a recent research study went a step further and looked at whether a so-called detox from social media can actually improve people's well-being. Researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research conducted the largest randomized experiment to find out. Joining us now to discuss the findings is Hunt Alcott, a professor at Stanford University and a member of the research team. Hunt, thank you for joining us, and let's jump right in. What exactly did you find about the impact that social media can have on a person's well-being?
We estimated that quitting Facebook or Instagram for the 5 weeks before the 2020 election increased an index of people's happiness, anxiety, and depression.
Hunt, as you looked at this research and you saw what the effect was on that detox, I'm struck by the reality that adults, are just as addicted to social media as kids are. We often think about it as a kid's problem, but adults are really the ones often scrolling. It's parents, it's grandparents, it's everybody. But kids have these formative minds, where this stuff may be affecting them differently. Did you dissect at all the difference between how an adult can benefit by some of this detox versus how you can set boundaries for kids in a way that does not increase the likelihood of addiction?
Our study included only people who were 18 and over. And so our study says nothing directly about folks under 18. What we did see in our study is that, because we have a variety of people from as young as 18 to much older than that, we can look at the subgroups of people who are relatively young versus relatively old in our sample. And for Instagram in particular, we found that the improvements in happiness, anxiety, and depression that we saw from quitting Instagram were particularly strong for young women. And I think that is consistent with some of the concerns that people have had about how Instagram may play a role in negative body image issues.
And you noted in the study that one of the problems with keeping people appropriately randomized in terms of the decline of usage or lack of usage on Facebook and Instagram was that a lot of them just went to other apps and started using those more on their phone or computers. Have you considered doing a follow-up study where they do a full digital detox and seeing the impacts of that?
We have actually done such a study before.
Great.
We have
Tell me
another
about
paper
it.
that was published in 2022. It was called Digital Addiction. And there we actually paid people to use less of a whole suite of 6 social media apps: Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, web browsers, and YouTube. And there we found that that it was quite interesting, actually. People told us in advance, we would like to use less social media. And then when we gave people access to time-limiting apps on their phones that allow them to set in advance, I want to use less social media, that actually substantially reduced their social media use. And there was some indication in the data that that improved people's sense of subjective well-being.
And Hunt, on that point, do you think that there's a general acceptance, although we are addicted and we can't put the phones down, we can't put them away, we can't stop scrolling, is there a social license perhaps to create some boundaries, regulatory boundaries, whether it's on the apps themselves or in certain, physical locations, or for kids or young adults who are just, forming their opinions on the world? Are those boundaries acceptable to people? Do they want to be regulated, in other words?
There's a great recent study that was done by some other researchers that showed that if you survey people, many people will say, I would like to individually keep using social media, but if I could get everybody else to quit, then I would also like to quit, and I think everybody would be better off. And so this is what you might call a collective action problem. And so I think this raises some questions around whether if at a higher societal level, we might actually benefit people overall if we could somehow reduce everybody's attachment to our smartphones. And so I think this raises important questions for example, school administrators. Our research team with Angela Duckworth and Matthew Jensko, we're doing some work trying to understand the benefits and costs and overall impacts of banning smartphone use in schools. So stay tuned for that.
Oh, that's awesome. I'd love to hear the results of that. We'll have to have you back to discuss it. Final question for you. We've seen Instagram recently introduce this teen-friendly account, they call it, where it limits who they're able to DM and what content they're able to see. Do you foresee perhaps other social media companies jumping on this trend in response to the public concern about usage, particularly for young people, and maybe limiting other features like endless scroll or some of the more addictive functions of their apps?
My sense is that all of the social media companies are interested in doing as good of a job as possible for their users, and then at the same time they are constrained by the fact that they're businesses that need to raise ad revenue through increasing user engagement. And I think that's the key tension that all these companies face. As they think about these sorts of policies, I think there are various types of things they're considering. One is the content that flows through the platform and who you can communicate with, which I think is part of what you were referring to. And then there's a separate question of just like whether we're spending a lot of time on our smartphones, which is about social media use, which is about all sorts of the other apps on our smartphones, and whether in the process of doing that, we are losing track of all the great things that are happening in the world in front of us.
Well, thank you, Hunt, for coming on and helping us break down your research. Really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, next on Rising, we'll get to the feisty encounter between a reporter from the Daily Caller News Foundation and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar had some not-so-nice words for a reporter who tried asking her a question. Miles Morell of the Daily Caller News Foundation captured the moment and uploaded it on X. Let's watch.
Congresswoman Omar, I'm Miles Morell with the Daily Caller News Foundation. Do you think more of your Democratic colleagues should be traveling to El Salvador to advocate on behalf of Abrego Garcia?
I think you should off. Yeah,
I'm sorry, what? Congresswoman?
off.
Who should?
You.
Why me?
We're not taking any questions right now, but here you go.
Yeah, thanks.
Morell posted on X, "That was very unprofessional of her. Our elected officials should not be acting this way."
Meanwhile, the Congresswoman doubled down, writing on X, "I said what I said. You and all your miserable trolls can, well, you know what."
Some Democrats have been trying out a new attitude that some are dubbing dark woke. The New York Times describes it as crass but discerning, rude but only to a point. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, for instance, told a reporter in February that Elon Musk should F off. Oh boy, okay, so I think we probably both agree that this was pretty inappropriate, disrespectful, but I'll let you speak for yourself.
Yeah, look, I think that Democrats, maybe not this exact experience, but there's some other moments where they've used some expletives and been a lot of noting on the Twitter accounts of the DCCC, and some other prominent Democrats are getting a little more spicy with their language overall. I think that's maybe an effort to try to cut through. That's partly what this dark woke thing is. Let's be authentic. Let's talk to voters. My problem here is you simply can't grab some bad words and have that be your brand or your message delivery device. Authenticity isn't just about that. I do think we should speak less like politicians. That's a thing that we should probably do as Democrats. And if every now and again you can use a choice word to demonstrate that and show that you're connecting to people on a level that they actually talk like in their daily lives, wonderful. But I think maybe we're tipping a little too far if that's the only play in the playbook.
Yeah, and I think actually in a lot of cases a politician throwing in curse words to seem edgy or cool actually comes across as even more inauthentic.
Can be cringe.
Right, very cringe. So it's an interesting strategy for sure. I do think it's interesting that you haven't had the similar outcry in response to this interaction with a reporter that we would often hear if a Republican were involved in a similar situation, like Marjorie Taylor Greene cursing out a British reporter recently, telling them to F off and go back to the UK. We talked about it on the show. I said, yeah, that was too far, right? I think you can criticize coverage and even criticize an outlet, but if you're making personal attacks on a reporter that have nothing to do with what might be a reasonable question or a straightforward question, then that's not appropriate from a member of Congress, and she was accused of like attacking the free press and not valuing the First Amendment. I would like to see some similar outcry here because, as we saw in that clip, that was a very straightforward, reasonable question. There's no reason for her to react that way.
Well, look, I will take a nuanced position here if I could. One is that I think Ilhan Omar gets a lot of abuse and targeted attacks, often from the right, often that I think is unfair to her actual position and posture, and that makes her a bit of a target and perhaps sensitive in the moment to those sort of things. That said, I agree with you. You've got to rise above that. You've got to be above the fray and contribute to an opportunity to have this dialogue with the press that values the fact that we have a free press in this country. And whether you're on the left side of the spectrum or the right side of the spectrum or a moderate or inside government or outside government, I don't like it when Donald Trump does it. I don't like it when Marjorie Taylor Greene does it. And I don't like it when Ilhan Omar does it. We have to respect the fact that the free press is part of the civil society that does make this country great. And losing that is bad for everybody.
I wanted to go back to your point about authenticity and the Democrats kind of searching for how to talk to voters, because I think that's a really important point. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this story from earlier this week where Governor Tim Walz was talking about how he was basically the code talker for white guys on the past campaign, because I don't think it worked out that well, to be honest with you. And so I'm wondering what it is you think Democrats can actually do to really attract the white working class voters that have kind of fled the party since the rise of Trump.
Yeah, well, look, I know that people want to dunk on Tim Walz for this.
I'll do it all day.
Go ahead, but look, Governor Walz is very good at this. And no, he really is. And 107 days of a campaign, when you're trying to do everything at once, you're trying to test messages, get ready for a debate, roll things out there, deal with your new top of the ticket candidate in Kamala Harris, and then figure out where you fit in, is really tough. Not many people would do that seamlessly. And I think that Governor Walz was a little constrained by the campaign because we didn't know exactly how to use him in that moment when we had to also credential and elevate Kamala Harris. So he had a tough mission in 2024, but his record as governor, his record winning in a rural red district, in the 2010 Tea Party wave, when healthcare, politics, and anger on the right kind of like overtook many, many Democrats across the country, did not overtake Tim Walz because they did see him authentically as someone who lived in their community, knew how to fix a truck, understood what ag politics looked like, understood what people go through on a daily basis, and he can talk to folks in a very real way. Now, that said, we do need to cultivate that at all levels. And one thing that we have done, partly because of how congressional districts have become packed in so that Republicans are now more geographically isolated from Democrats, is that we've lost touch with some of those very common bonds that all Americans have. We need to do better at running candidates in districts everywhere and then listening to them and adopting some of those positions and that empathy with regular Americans, and not just be focused on what works on Twitter, what works in East Coast liberal establishments.
If you could go back, hindsight's 2020, obviously, but what do you think Governor Walz could have done differently in terms of his messaging that would have allowed voters to see what you claim is actually a very effective communication?
Again, a nuanced take here. I would go back and put him out there more. I think we could have used him in lots of different spaces. I think we could have sort of.
I think Republicans would have loved that.
Well, maybe, but look, if we'd done it in a way that let him really kind of be who he was and not try to be so prescribed, I think he could have done well. But that's not going to change the game. That wouldn't have moved a couple 100,000 votes. I think it might have been a little bit better, but given the constraints of that campaign in 107 days, I don't have a lot of critiques about that. But I do think there's something to be learned from the experience of showing up. I'll tell you somebody else who's really good in Minnesota. Angie Craig, now running for Senate, overperformed her district by 14 points over Kamala Harris because she shows up in those ag breakfasts every single time and talks to folks very real and very authentically. Doesn't have to sort of like pepper in language. It's not her. She just is her. And those kind of authentic Democrats are really missing currency in our party.
This might be an odd question, but are you a gun owner, Dan?
I'm not a gun owner.
Okay. You should find someone to teach Tim Walz how to load a shotgun. I think that would go a long way. Next on Rising, the latest trend, cross necklaces apparently. Trend alert, social media is buzzing with what apparently is the latest hot accessory, cross necklaces. I'm wearing mine today. Influencers, celebrities, White House staff, and more have been seen donning the jewelry. The accessories seem to have a renewed sense of popularity on red carpets, social media, and even at protests attended by high-ranking Democrats. Trendy pop star Sabrina Carpenter was wearing one in her music video for the song Please, Please, Please. And music rising star Chappell Roan wore a sizable one to the MTV Video Music Awards last year.
Meanwhile, recent Gallup polling shows young Americans are becoming less religious. So why are young Americans recently sporting crosses despite historically low religious rates?
I don't see this as a new trend, to be honest. Madonna had crosses all over herself back in the 80s, so pop stars wearing crosses is nothing new. But what I found interesting about this was the entire New York Times profile about cross necklaces, as if they had just discovered Christianity existed. I mean, the headline was like, hot new accessory, cross necklaces are all over the White House. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of Christians working for the Trump administration, and they like to openly espouse their faith. It's weird to me.
I do think it's culture is sort of like, to your point, the New York Times culture, maybe culture somewhere else in the country is clashing at this point and just figuring each other out a little bit. But there's something about the rates of historical or the current religious affinity that folks have in this country and across not just the United States, but North America, Europe, Latin America. Religion as a devoted thing you do is going down. But I think what's changing now perhaps is the idea that the institution itself, the church itself, going to church has been declining for years. But people are leaving institutions of all stripes at the moment, whether it's the federal government, whether it's academia, whether it's churches, but looking to folks online, looking to influencers, looking to maybe outsiders to tell them something about how they could behave and dress and connect. And I wonder if perhaps part of this is, with the influencer culture rising, it gives folks a chance to access this differently than just going to church and attending a service in that way.
One of the things that we've been talking about on the show of late is this issue of declining religiosity, especially among young people. And one of the things that I found just in my own experience going to Mass and talking to folks my age is that the ones who are interested in religion like a really traditional version of religion, whether it's the Catholic Church, Orthodoxy, Anglican, which some people refer to as sort of Catholic light. And it's really because they feel like it offers them something that the culture doesn't currently right now, because culture has become so secular in the United States. So you're kind of seeing this division where you have one sector of young people becoming less religious than ever, but the ones who are really interested in like the 2,000-year-old theology and the very traditional movements and the sort of Gothic architecture and all of these things that they feel they don't get in other parts of their life.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think that there are people in the left part of the political sphere, at least, who are finding some new ways to engage with religion or with spirituality in general in this moment, because we're in a tense, anxious world, right? You wake up tense, you read the news, you're tense. You're having stress and tension in your life at work, whether it's economic or whether it's political, and finding some peace, which is a large part of what you do perhaps at a service, is a welcoming thing. My fiance was a very devoted Catholic for years and kind of left the church largely over some of the policies and the doctrine, but has come back recently, and we're attending services every week. And I'm not very religious myself, but I can really understand the value of being in that place and having that presence and not looking at your phone and not looking at social media and absorbing something and thinking about it and having some quiet in your life. I wonder, part of that, certainly for the folks on the left who may have left religion but come back to it for that reason, that trend might increase.
Yeah, I went to confession recently, and the priest said something very useful, which is Mass is the 1 hour a week where you are separate from the crazy things happening in this city, and it's basically a sanctuary for people, and you should make use of that. And I thought that was really sage advice. One of the other things I wanted to bring up in this read, we talked about Sabrina Carpenter wearing a cross necklace in a recent music video, and you've got to let me tee off on this one, Dan, because I think one of the things that does frustrate Christians is when they see these pop stars sort of almost appropriating the faith. And I'm not like a cultural appropriation person, but it is the case that these are obviously religious symbols. And Sabrina Carpenter, in a previous music video, Feather, had actually desecrated a Catholic altar in New York. She had put all of these idolatry items on the altar. She was dancing in her brief underwear on the altar in the sanctuary of the church. And when pressed about it, said, well, Jesus was a carpenter, referring to her fan base as carpenters. And it was actually deemed such an offense to the church that they had to have a special mass where they basically re-sanctified the altar. and the priest who approved the filming of the music video ended up being demoted for his decision to do that. So for her to now do a new music video wearing the cross, I'm like,
You're not buying it?
Get that off. Take it off.
Well, if I could see out for a second, that's a very fair point, by the way. And I think that doing that sort of thing just to get attention is probably not the best way to go about it. But I would say for liberals sometimes, and especially for liberals with faith, true faith in their life, if they see some of the really devastatingly mean politics that come out sometimes on the right, especially on immigrants, and some of the rhetoric that comes out on immigrants while you're wearing the cross. And you can be tough on immigration, you can be tough on the border, you can have a policy that involves deportations even, right? But some of the rhetoric, some of the way we talk about people as poisoning the blood of this country when they're themselves fleeing the cartel and just trying to find a way to live their own lives, seems very anti-Christian to me, and I think there's a fair critique of those on the right who proudly display the cross, but at the same time do some very un-Christian things.
I think that's a very simplistic way of talking about politics and faith and the intersection, because there's often this rhetoric that I hear from people about how Christians are just supposed to be nice all the time. And it's really an oversimplification of the faith. I mean, yes, you are supposed to be nice to people, but that doesn't mean that if someone spits in your eye, you're not allowed to defend yourself, right?
Yeah.
Or that if someone does something that's counter to your faith, that you're not allowed to defend yourself. And I think, unfortunately, there is this narrative around Christianity in particular that does not often get talked about in regards to other religions, whether it's Judaism, Islam, Sikh, Hindu, whatever it is. Where Christians are just supposed to kind of sit down and shut up and take whatever's offered to them, and they're not allowed to ever go on the offensive against things that they find problematic in society, culture, politics. And it's really strange to me, the double standard.
So here's what I'll say. I think that you're right about that, and I don't think that you can apply that as a broad brush and say just sit down, turn the other cheek, welcome all in, open borders, right? I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that we live in a world that's imperfect, right? We're going to make imperfect choices. People are going to be imperfect. But if you really believe in both fairness, in finding ways to help people live a better life, and you also need to be tough sometimes when someone spits in your face, that's part of life as well, that's great. But the standard should be high to do it in a way that is fair, is honest, and does not leverage other biases and bigotry to achieve your ends. And sometimes it tips the other way. You can be tough. You don't have to turn the other cheek every time. But there's a tipping line I think Republicans and some conservatives go off a little too far on.
All right, that's going to do it for us today on Rising, actually. Spicy one to end on. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.